And then I think, yes, both Will and Jem have made the ultimate sacrifice and taken themselves out of the Google Hangout. So we're going to try with this now and see if we can get back on track. So sorry about that, everybody. We'll try going back to where we'd got to in the PowerPoint. And coming back to then the reasons for moving online to improve the quality of the learning experience. And there's three that we're going to look at: supporting independent learning, supporting a range of types of learning, and providing more personalized support to students. So one of the designs that we've got in the online and blended section of the browser is one that derives from the research literature, especially a study of looking at what happens when you're trying to prepare students for a lecture. Very interesting study, and there's reference to it in the description of the design. So in that description, it gives a reference to the study which was done by Dan Schwartz and colleagues in Stanford. And they looked at giving students a particular kind of exercise prior to the lecture, which then enabled them to focus on the lecture more carefully and derive a better understanding of the concepts afterwards. So that's what's represented in the face-to-face version of this. And what we looked at was what it would happen if we took that whole process and put it online. And there were some ways in which we thought you could add to the learning experience. So this slide gives a representation of the contrast between those two different kinds of pattern, the one that is face-to-face and the one that then runs online. One of the things we can see is that you get a higher proportion of the active forms of learning. So where there's 38% of acquisition learning in the face-to-face, is 27% of that when it's online. So let's just look at the version of the learning design which has that. I'll go back to screen share and look at the learning designer. So this screen shows the representation of that learning design, which has the face-to-face version. And it begins with, on the left-hand side, there's a pre-lecture series of individual learning activities for one student to do on their own. So you can see the number of students in each of these is just one. They begin with reading through a summary of case studies. So the idea of this, instead of doing it on the original version, which was to understand different concepts of the psychology of memory, this is about different concepts of cost. So it's just taking exactly the same pattern but converted it for a different subject area. So they read through the summary of the case studies, and then they practice analyzing these contrasting cases to try and generate distinctions between the different kinds of costs as they appear in those case studies, and then produce their own definitions. Then they come to the lecture and they listen to the lecture and then use the lecture to try and make notes on their definitions. And then after that, they go through a test to see how well they can now differentiate those different types of cost. So we can see that this is 160 minutes of learning altogether, including the before and after. Underneath the pattern, we've done an estimate of how much time it takes the teachers to support this process. And of course, there's 60 minutes in the lecture, and then they're checking through what the students have done on the test. So you could estimate that at about 2 minutes per student for a class of 30 students. Now, the alternative to that is that we look at the online version, and I'm going to go into edit mode by turning the editing on here. And we can see if I switch between these two different versions that the pie charts are a bit different. And what's changed in the pie chart is that we've got more learning through production, more learning through practice, and we've also added learning through collaboration, the orange bit. Now, where's that come from? Well, that's because in the preparation, it's been possible to get students working online together to, once they've done their analysis of the contrasting cases, then to have this collaboration where they're working with a partner on Skype to share the distinctions they've come up with between the different cases and generate a shared version, which they then post to the forum. They read through other groups' posts, making notes on ones which they think are good, and then they work to produce their own refined definitions. So you've got some considerable degree of interaction between students, building on what each other has thought and done, working together to discuss what they think the issues are as they're looking through these case studies, and then they come to the lecture presentation in exactly the same way, except that this lecture is now a presentation on the concept of cost, which lasts for about 10 minutes, so that's a much shorter version, but with slides with voiceovers. So instead of just video, you've also got the slides with voiceover, which are explaining each definition. And because it's asynchronous, of course, students can take their own time about how much of that they look at. So this might actually, for a particular student, end up being quite a bit more than another 20 minutes. And then they're going back to use those resources to make notes on their own definition that will help them improve it. So we could say that's about the same amount of time, but instead of listening to the lecture and making notes all of that time, they're actually working with the resources, both listening and watching and then producing their own version. And then in the final bit, here they've got the same test where they have to, again, this is now a multiple choice test, and they're selecting one or more types of cost represented in each case, in each of a set of new cases which has been presented to them. So it's a moderately tough test of whether they've picked up the idea behind these different kinds of concept of cost. Then they get a score on the test, and then they try to improve their score by going back to the lecture and retaking the test, where the test can give them explanations of why each answer is the way it is. So this is a formative process, at the end of which, when they've improved their test scores, they can now link the correct answers into their course portfolio. And the course portfolio was something that they began by using in the first section, where they put down their initial definitions, and now they put down all the correct analysis which they've got out of this. So just going back then to the slide. There we can see that we have the comparison of having a lower proportion of acquisition learning, but we've got a lot more learning going on because it's a longer process. We had tutor feedback in the first one, we've got automated feedback in the second one. Now that could be problematic because the tutor feedback can be more personalized to what the student has actually written. On the other hand, the tutor is only giving a couple of minutes to each of their 30 students that they're writing feedback on, and that may not be terribly well personalized. The automated feedback you get by doing the multiple choice question could be better for them. The class time is restricted, so you can only do so much during the class. And even prior to the class, the student is essentially working on their own, whereas online they can include time for collaboration, so that increases the time. That independent learning is less well supported. You can have text-based materials to support them, to tell them what to do, but with the practice in the test, you've got more support for motivating them doing practice. All of their outputs are recorded as digital resources, so that they've got a record of what they did in the first place on their course portfolio, and then how that worked out in the test. And then that whole process, what they're doing throughout the period of study, is scaffolded and orchestrated to help them work with each other, work on their own, work with resources. So they're kind of taken care of a bit more. You could think of it like that. That the online version ought to be able to give them a bit more support. So going back now to the design itself, we can see that we've got the two different pie charts from the online session there and from the face-to-face session there. The face-to-face session has 160 minutes of designed learning time, whereas the online session has 220 minutes. Now, it may be that students are actually spending more of their own time doing the study, but this is where the teacher has taken some care to try and support them through that process. And we have these additional bits of practice, iterative practice around doing the test. So the point of this analysis is to get us to think much more carefully about the kind of support that we're giving to students and the ways in which learning online can work better for them. Then, if we go on to thinking about teacher time, what we did in those two examples was to do a rough calculation of how much time it would take the teacher to support the students in those various parts of their learning design. And by preparing more fixed cost learning support time, that is, preparing the interactive test, preparing the way in which students are to collaborate and work together, by preparing the way in which the test gives some feedback to students, by preparing the course portfolio for them to work with. Those are all things that the teacher only has to do once, no matter how many students they have. So they are spending more time on preparation, but that's time they don't have to also spend in running the class and in giving feedback to each individual learner. So you might be able to reduce the class presentation time. You're still producing a video but and an audio over PowerPoint, but that can run for other classes as well. And those students can also go back and run those same things again. So it provides more flexible support to them. So what we hope then is that by doing that shift, it's possible for the teacher to release more time for their individual support per student or per group. So you might be able to get the teacher over a period of a week or a term to be able to spend a bit more time with each student individually. How that works out overall will depend a lot on the number of students they have. So that's why when we come to weeks 4 and 5, we're going to be looking at the course resource appraisal model to see how that works out over the course of a term or a whole module within a course. Then what we'll be doing over this week and next week, therefore, is looking at what we can do with our designs to make them work better online, and then sharing those designs with other people, and then coming back to review. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But before we do that, I'd like to see if we can bring some people in to joining us on the Q&A. So if you'd like to try coming in now, we do have one person in there who's joined us now. Can't tell. So Victoria. Victoria, you might like to come in and join us on the Hangout. If you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead, unmute your microphone, put your camera on, try asking us a question. Jem, you might like to try the same.
We're being advised that if the participants put headphones on, it might affect, be better for the audio.
Okay, Victoria, are you speaking? Do you want to do that? When I'm not hearing you at the moment, have you unmuted your microphone? If you roll over the microphone icon at the top of the screen and click it, you should be able to unmute it. Can't hear you at the moment. Or you could try going over to the other side of to the left-hand side of the screen and joining on chat. Ah, there was a little burst of sound. Nothing coming through at the moment. Could you try chat, Victoria, see if that comes through? And Jem, could we see if you can ask a question or make a comment there? Nothing coming through from anybody. Can you hear anything at all?
I can hear you.
You can hear me all right. Ah, could be a problem with voice. Yes, there is a problem with voice, Victoria. We can't hear you. So if you have a question or a comment, would you like to put it into the chat, because we can see you there on chat. Do we have any? Was it coming in on any other medium? Twitter, email?
No, I haven't seen it.
Okay. No, nothing coming in from anybody. I didn't try LD up till now. Didn't have time. Okay, that's fine. It'll be there whenever you want to use it, so that's absolutely fine. We've lost Will completely, have we? Yep. And Jim, are you there to try coming in on audio and video? So we could hear you very well before.
Yeah.
Ah, who was that? Is that Victoria actually able to join us? No, I don't think so. Oh, there's Jim. Jim, try to see if you can speak to us. I'm busy having a chat with someone else. Jim, I'd just like to point out you're on air.
Could you not hear them? I can't hear anything anymore.
No, Jim is muted. He is muted. Okay, Jim, are you going to talk to us? We can see you very well. Can't hear you at all. I think you're muted.
Can you hear them? No, just turn.
There we go. That should be there. No screeching.
You're on air. Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Apologies about that. One of the biggest problems with technology is getting it to work for you rather than against you.
Yeah, we are discovering that, exactly. So, Jim, are you going to talk to us?
Yes, absolutely.
Please go ahead. We can see you very well. Can't hear you at all.
2 seconds, because
I think you're
I've got
muted.
multiple streams going on. I've just had to dash off downstairs to pick up the equipment. Do we want to have a bit of a quick refresh? We've got the saving time for the tutors. We've got we're into the creation of the designs this week. Yeah. One of the biggest things for me was about where we had put a lot of investment and time in the creation of some of those activities and some of the learning designs, and how to translate them across. And it does take a lot of time to just pick out, for us, for example, just establishing how much time we would normally expect a tutor to be spending developing some of these activities. How much time, we always get a student saying, how much time should I spend reading? How much time should I spend researching, as if it's some kind of time out until the web browser shuts down. And it's always been a complex situation for us to balance that amount of face-to-face time where you have distinct timelines of within 45 minutes we need to get this kind of learning across, or we need to engage the groups in this kind of discussion, into something that is going to be a lot more, as much time as you want to spend and as much time as you want to that you need to spend. So it's a real challenge to just looking through the designer and to just stating exactly how much time you think each of those elements should be. And also for a tutor, they say, how much time is it going to take me to get to grips with this new system? So the time element and the balancing of how much as an indicator you'd expect students to spend on those seems to be quite an important thing to nail down, to pin down, alongside all of the planned outcomes.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think what this process reveals is how inexpert we all are at the business of trying to support students in using their time as well as possible. Now, their time is very precious. It's as precious as ours. They're paying us a lot to help them work out how best to spend their time. So I think the least we can do is try to tackle that in as realistic a way as we possibly can, to say, well, what we're really trying to do here is to make sure that we can suggest to you the optimal time for you to be spending on these different activities. So I don't think we can sort of not take responsibility for doing that. It is difficult, and we should give it our best shot. And of course, we tell students that this is a default time, an expectation of what we think it's going to take you. But we've got to take responsibility for saying, well, is this 10 minutes to read this paper, or is it an hour? Mm. And actually, when you start thinking about, well, this is a 10-page paper, it's quite complex stuff. Assume that students read at about 100 words a minute at best, and then they probably need to read over some bits over and over again. Actually, it comes out to something like an hour and a half. Now, if we're not taking care of that, then we're not working out the best possible way for students to be spending their time. When we're thinking about how long it's going to take them to agree about the description they give of case studies or something like that, that's also something we've got to think about. Well, how long will it take? You know, they've got to go back to their notes, they've got to talk it through, they've got to think about what's the best way to describe it, they've got to argue about that a bit, decide on the best approach. That's not going to be 10 minutes, is it? It's going to be at least 20. You know, it's that kind of thing. So unless we're being serious about that, we're not doing our best for our students. And unless we're getting some kind of an idea about, well, we're giving them not just masses and masses of reading and not just watching talking heads and so on, but we're actually getting them to do some active thinking as well, that's equally important. So I don't think there's anything we can do about that. I mean, people are used to planning face-to-face teaching time. The problem is that traditionally a lot of that has just been me talking for 50 minutes and then we have a bit of Q&A, and that's all the planning anybody ever does. Well, I think we found we got a bit more sophisticated than that. I mean, do you think it's unrealistic to ask that of people?
No, I think it's just a challenge to actually say to someone, okay, well, how much time do you expect someone to do in the research and analysis of a particular organisation? Is it literally spend 10 minutes on their website, or is it going to be a 2-hour go in and we want you to be pulling out reports and maybe some back history? And that one element of the design, the learning designer, that I really did like was the ability to literally just scope that out and ask the question of the academic, why do they need to go and investigate that organisation? Yeah. What is the purpose of that? Don't just say we're going to look at this case study. What is the part of the story? What is the part of the learning? Because we can then build that into our default template, and then we can adjust. As you say, it's the early stage of setup to say it's the upfront loading, but once you've got that, I know that there's 6 case studies that I use. I have a similar reason for including those 6 case studies, or actually there's one really favourable case study that I always come back to, and I have different ways that students will adapt and work on that depending on the level and depending on whether it's a read and we just want to have a bit of a background knowledge, or let's look in at the business decisions that were made on that particular organisation. I really did like that.
Now, you've just articulated exactly what you should be asking that lecturer to do, because not only have you said how long are they meant to spend on it, but also what kind of thing they're meant to get out of it. So that gives students an awful lot more support when they go to that site. I mean, how do they know what they're meant to be doing with it? It's unreasonable to expect them to come up with the best possible way of going through it. It's the tutor who knows much better what kind of thing they should be doing. So I think that's only good. Then you might come back to the question of saying, well, how long is it going to take us to think all that through? And that's a fair question. And I think it's certainly the case that when we put things online, it does take longer. We do spend more time in thinking that through, in organizing resources, and in this sort of thing about timing, thinking about the timing for students. All of those are important aspects of the design process. But the advantages of that, what I was trying to talk through before, is that you should then be able to reuse that design in a number of different places, which is part of the point of having the learning design.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you for that. Victoria has
we've got something from Victoria there. The RD approach is interesting because I think it's helping me plan students' workload. Yes, well, that's exactly the point we've just been discussing, Victoria, is that this whole thing came about really because there were so many assumptions being made about being able to go online, and it would all just be exactly the same as it was before when we were teaching face-to-face, and that's just not correct. And also the assumptions being made about how well students could figure out the best way to do things for themselves. So it's important for us to be thinking about that. And yes, we don't think about it. I mean, the number of times that we've been through this with lecturers, and they've said, okay, I'm going to plan out 120 minutes, a sort of 2-hour workshop. And they get down to starting to plan it out, and by the time they got to the point where they check back how well they've done, they've now got 3.5 hours planned. It's terribly easy to do that because we grossly underestimate how much time it takes to do things, and how much 2 hours really is in terms of what you can get through. So it's very important to do that.
We also have filler. We have a lot of, okay, when you actually start planning it, what was meant to be 2 to 3 hours is actually only really going to be about 45 minutes of study online. And it's just that, almost that misunderstanding of the tutor of just how rapidly people can find that information out online compared to face-to-face, compared to the more case study or discursive online. And also the fact that a 10-minute part of the dialogue may have been a contribution of 10 minutes for that student, but in order to contribute, they've had to read for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours over a week-long period as that discussion has grown and grown and grown. So again, it may be a 10-minute contribution, but that has an underlying requirement for further as well. And that's really about getting the academics and the tutor to really rethink about how much investment in time the student needs to fully equip them with everything they need pre-task to then properly engage with that task. And that's always a challenge.
Yeah, and as Victoria is just pointing out in the chat there, this is something which HE teachers don't really think about or engage with, and I think that's right. And that's partly because traditionally it's all been done face-to-face, and that's the time that you think about. You think about your contact time with students, whether it's in a lab or it's in a classroom or it's a small group or it's a tutorial or it's a lecture, whatever it is. That's what the teacher is comfortable knowing about. I know I've got a 1-hour tutorial and I know roughly what we're going to do within it. Or I've got a 2-hour lab session or a one-day trip on a field trip or something like that. And you're used to thinking about that. But we've got to scaffold now what's happening when the student isn't with us. And there's going to be a lot of that time because there's such pressure in universities and in colleges on the amount of work that you have to help students get through. You can't do it all in a face-to-face session, and it's not an efficient way to do it. So unless we begin to get to grips with thinking about what is really going on. I mean, in our master's course, for example, we have 30 credit master's modules. They're meant to provide for 300 hours of study. If you ask an academic how much learning time that is, they can tell you about the 30 hours of contact time they have with students. That's another 270 self-regulated learning hours after that. That's not really the right way to think about it. We've got to grapple with that much more carefully, I think.
And we are facing that with change of approval events where we have, this has been running full-time for such a long time, and now we're suddenly having to shift for online. And it is that online as well as distance, because we may be delivering to different countries, there's international students to consider, there's that variation that is about, okay, this is it's basically a revalidation rather than purely a change of approval, because we have to redevelop for exactly those things that you've mentioned. And you said about flexibility in the early slides, about being flexible enough that someone who is in a full-time study mode could literally switch on to the distance learning mode, would see the same kind of activity, but there would be very, very strict ideas about, okay, this is going to be a 2-hour task, so if you are just coming back from work and you thought, I need to get on and do my coursework, then just bear in mind you need to dedicate 2 hours of your time to that. And it's that preparation of the impact and the amount of investment of time of that student, which again, it's rethinking for the academic away from the front of the classroom into, right, this is how it's going to be, and this is how we have to justify it, and this is how the validation panels are going to have to see, is it an equivalent experience, or are you literally just saying, well, it takes this long to study the area, we'll make that online. It's
yeah,
very
exactly. I think those are very good points. And what we also find is, of course, that within the learning designer, when you've got that all mapped out, and then you run the session or you run the online session and you realize actually how much time those things did take, and then you can go back and adjust those times. Then you've got it for the next time you do it, or when you try to do that same kind of thing in a different class. So that's another way, hopefully, in which we can become a bit more professional about the way we do these things. I'm going to move on now. It was great to have the opportunity for an interactive discussion there, John. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we couldn't get Victoria actually online, but we had her in the chat. Oh, she's another thing. I'd like to try this approach of planning my course at least by one topic and see what will happen. Best way to do it, Victoria, just do it, and hope it comes out. So just to reflect now on the criteria for guiding designs, if we go to the course sites, in course sites for this week, for week 2, we're asking you to think about the criteria for guiding designs, and in the resources over here on the left, if you click on that, you find the criteria for effective learning design, and that brings up a document which has a number of criteria for thinking about doing a good design. Some of those would relate to what we've just been talking about and being able to think through the timings, but there's also some ways of thinking about what should we be sure is in the design. And one of those is some kind of test. We've got a learning outcome. We know roughly what we want the students to get out of it. Well, as they're working through it, how do we know if they've actually achieved that outcome? So one question to ask of your design is there a way for the teacher to test whether the learning outcomes are met? Sometimes that might just be through lurking on a forum and looking at the ways in which students are discussing things. It would be through a Q&A process, so you ask the students a certain kind of question, you see what kinds of questions and comments they come back with. That could be a way of, could be sufficient. Getting them to produce something is the best way, some way of representing what they think they've learned. So that's why the produce activity is so important within the learning design, because that's where you get the best test of whether they've actually managed to understand things. Alignment is an important characteristic because we have to think through, have we got the right kinds of activities which are going to help students achieve that outcome? And then do we also have the appropriate test given the kinds of activities that we've got? So the alignment between the outcome, the activities, and the tests are all very important for this, whatever kind of assessment you have. Now, of course, very often we don't have a particular assessment for each session of teaching that we do. That all gets rolled into an exam at the end of the whole module or something of that kind. But we do have the opportunities, and we have them much more when we're online, to eavesdrop on conversations or see what's going on in forums or have a Q&A process, which allows us to see how well students are doing. So that alignment is something we can really take quite realistically when we're managing online. Feedback is always important. It's one of the most important things in learning. So having some kind of formative feedback, which can be peer-to-peer or directly from the teacher, or it can be extrinsic feedback from a multiple choice test or quiz or just hints and comments from the teacher or from other students. And then sometimes you can get a good program, like a model of a system. It could be a business model, it could be a climate model, it could be something in a scientific context or an economic context, for example, where you're using a model of some system, and what you set the students the task of doing is to find the optimal parameters that achieve some particular output. Suppose it was a climate model and you're trying to get them to produce a global mean temperature rise of 0.5 centigrade over 100 years or something. Well, there's a specific output. You've got to get this model to generate. So that's quite a tough test, and it's the software that provides the feedback on how well you're doing it. So that kind of intrinsic feedback is just what we should be using technology for. Because you can't do that with every subject area. And sometimes intrinsic feedback can come by comparing what you've done with a model answer. And that's a kind of like a commentary on how well you've done this in relation to the goal that we're trying to get to in this particular exercise. So looking for those different types of feedback. Am I building that in sufficient ways into the design that I've made? And the technology, since a lot of this is all about using the technology as well as possible, let's look at whether we've got appropriate use of the technology. And there are some ideas there for what counts as appropriate use and what counts for inappropriate use. We're trying to support innovation, teaching innovation here, so there's a paragraph there on thinking about the ways in which we can support and assist teachers in becoming more innovative. And of course you may have your own criteria. Right at the end it shows you then how to create a review, and we'll be coming on to that next week. So I'm not going to go through that now. For this week we're just focusing really on making sure that people are happy with what they have to do in relation to creating their own design and then sharing it with others. So if we go back now to the PowerPoint, and just to finish off, so we've been through the criteria for learning. We've been through the criteria for guiding designs and feedback. When you've got a design, you want to share it. So how do you share it? And then how do you select a design? Well, that's what we've got the Padlet wall for. So if you go to the Padlet wall, and the address is in Course Sites, and it's a lovely environment in which all you have to do is just do a double click and add your own viewable image. And then the instructions there show you how you can make your design, which is in the Learning Designer, available to other people, so they can just click on that link and they'll go straight through to your design. And then when you're on the Padlet wall, to put your design up, you just do a double click and then put a long link into the little link icon, which is at the bottom of the screen there. Don't forget to put your name in, and then that picture of your design will appear on the Padlet wall. Then, when you get to the point of selecting someone else's design to review, there they all are. So all you have to do is find one that you like the look of, you'd be interested in reviewing, and on that little sticky note, which is on the Padlet wall, add your name as the reviewer, your name and email address. And then you can use those same criteria for doing a review of someone else's design. But we'll come back to that next week. For this week, we're still concentrating really on actually making the designs and sharing them with other people. Later this week, we've got a live discussion forum where there's an opportunity to use Blackboard Collaborate just to drop in for a live session. And if you've got a design which is throwing up some problems or issues, or you'd like us to look at it, then just send that in by Wednesday noon, and we'll try to respond to that. And of course, the challenges and resources you'd like to discuss, you can put those onto the Padlet wall. You can put them into Q&A during the session, and you can put them into emails and into the blog, which is on Course Sites as well. So let's now come back to see if we've got some more questions and comments coming through. So there's me, and Victoria has continued with her discussion. Oh no, it's the same thing she had before. So let's just, before we sign off, see if there are any more discussions, questions, or points to come through.
So it's a question from Will. He's on the Padlet wall, and he was saying, will you cover changes in organisation, few lecture spaces, more servers? And he makes a statement, you seem to assume the organisation is stable. Is this still design science? So there are, I suppose, 3 questions in one there from Will.
Well, I think what we can do by using these kinds of tools, and especially the Crown tool that we come to discuss in the final 2 weeks, is we are giving lecturers the ammunition with which to go to the managers who do decide what the resources are and how big the spaces are and where they are and what kind they are. So as we're coming to having to think through as lecturers, we're having to think through how our students are experiencing learning and in the different spaces in which they do it. So there are physical and social and online spaces, digital spaces, and they all blend together to create a learning experience. Now, the extent to which the people who are designing our university and college environments are aware of this is often very limited. We've had, at the Institute, we've had some new installations of a kind of lecterns and things which sit at the front of teaching areas, and they all violate the most important thing of flexibility. So they're absolutely static, you can't move them around, you can't reorient things, you can't mess with them at all. So I don't think people do understand just how much more flexibility we're trying to build into our systems. We're not trying to do all of those different things with these tools. We're trying to equip lecturers with the means to make sure they can describe and articulate what they're trying to do with their students. But then having that careful description, rigorous description of what we're trying to do, we then also have the ammunition to go to the managers and say, this won't do, this isn't good enough. We've got to have more space, more time, better online facilities to support students and so on. And not just that, but also understand our own workload planning better. Because in many organizations, you'll find that workload planning for academics and teachers works on an annual basis. Now, if we're thinking about developing a new course and we're aware of the fact that the upfront preparation is much longer and more complex when you're doing it online, and then you get the benefit of that because in later years you can update and upgrade those kinds of resources much more quickly, and you can use them with much larger numbers. Then we begin to see how the model of costing courses is going to change as we go into online and blended learning. So the CRAM tool is a way of trying to do that. So no, Will, in one sense, we're not trying to tackle, certainly not assuming that organizations and institutions are static, because they shouldn't be. They should be responsive to us. But we're not given the ammunition to create that dialogue with what our spaces should and our organizations should look like. So I think that's really the sense in which we're tackling that very important issue. Now, Patricia, did I cover all those points sufficiently, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure we'll come back.
I'm sure we'll come back if there's something further to go on there. Do come into the chat on Google if you want to.
Okay, so somebody's saying about there's a question coming here about the presentation being open in PowerPoint mode. Being open as a PowerPoint rather than as a presentation. And they're finding it difficult to follow the discussion on the Padlet wall. So I guess there's a couple of things there. Because there's a bit of a challenge using PowerPoint inside of Google Hangouts. So we've decided to use it in the way that we've used it. And the other thing is for discussions, obviously, the Padlet wall is just there for people to interact sort of immediately. So it isn't really meant to be for a discussion thread, the Padlet wall. It's meant to be just to place your questions. So it's appreciated. It's not meant for that. So they're right. And if they want to have a discussion, the forums are the discussion places, I think, for or questions on the Google, you know, Q&A. So they're right. It is difficult, but it's just for convenience really that we've used that. So we hope that helps.
We just wanted to have a way, if you're watching in course sites and you want right there to write something down. It certainly is very good with the letting us know when you can't hear something.
And then there was another. John says, thank you, that seems reasonable, the scope of the course, but the management issue is also interesting. I think designs, I think there's more to come from Will.
Mm-hmm.
John says, which is right, there seems to be a case for initial session to test out and troubleshoot the technology and techniques that will be needed for the course. Now, John, believe it or not, we have actually tested out many of these things a number of times, and yet there are still challenges, and so it isn't easy, and I think that stands up to what Diane has had to say. Otherwise, the problems get in the way of participating and learning, and that's true, and that's what we're seeing, and the technologies don't all sit well together and make it easy to navigate. And so we appreciate that is challenging as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really it's a key point about online learning generally, isn't it? That the technologies enable often learning to take place, so everybody's really excited because you can potentially join in a Q&A session live, but very often technologies seem to be a barrier, and I think that's a challenge for a teacher, isn't it, to be able to somehow intervene and stop something going, escalating into a very negative feeling. I mean, something that, I think when you teach online, you encounter all the, repeatedly that, you've got to kind of undo things, but and I think that we need to kind of respond to people differently than we would maybe in a class, but because of that, because you're often experiencing things on your own a long way away, in isolation, and it can feel maybe a bit worse when you can't communicate. So, there's certainly some things to remember.
I think there's knowing where's the best place to put the questions is tricky. Certainly, for me, when people are coming in on the group chat on Google, it's very helpful because it comes up right on the right-hand side, so it's right on the screen I'm looking at. So, for example, when Victoria is suggesting that it might be better to post questions in the forum in Blackboard, I can see that question immediately. I can't see the Blackboard ones. For me, it's better if you come in on the group chat. But if you're in the forum, that would be a better place, as Patricia was saying, to be doing discussions than the Padlet wall, which doesn't particularly lend itself to that. And Eileen and Patricia will certainly tell me when questions are coming in on the forum as well. So if there are any last questions before we sign off, we are over time now. I know we had a few glitches here and there. How are we doing?
I think I just wanted to reiterate that for the live session on Thursday, because we'll use the course sites live, which will be the Blackboard Collaborate, and that will be an easier forum to perhaps be able to do some discussion and to look more deeply at designs for people. So hopefully that will have a way to enable more of these threads where people haven't felt they can find their answers on the discussion forum or through email or Twitter or during the live sessions. So hopefully we can cover some of that then. So, but I haven't seen any more. Have there been any other questions?
Lynn is asking the Q&A forum where to put the design once she's created it for review, which is on the Padlet wall.
Yeah. So on the Padlet wall, yes.
Yes, and if you go back to the slides there, and we'll make these slides available in course sites as well, in case they're of use there. They can be one of the resources. So if you go to the Padlet wall and paste your link in there, then other people will be able to get directly to your design. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up there for now, and apologies for the glitches right at the start. They seem to have righted themselves somehow, even though we've got people coming in directly into the Google Hangout. But these are the mysteries of technology that we have to grapple with, and thank you very much for your patience. And we'll see you on Thursday in the live discussion forum, and again next Monday at the same time when we go through reviewing designs. Thanks again for joining us. That's all for now.